So welcome everyone to our May SAGE seminar for 2024, and we're very excited for this to be a book launch, but I'll get to that in a minute. So I just start with an acknowledgement of country. Griffith University acknowledges the traditional custodians on the land on which we're meeting and pays respects to the elders past and present, and extends that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I'm here on the land of the Kumbaberi and Yamaba people, and am always happy to have a place where I can call home thanks to their welcome. Just some general housekeeping. Please keep your microphone on mute so we can avoid background noise. We will definitely have time for questions because we're hoping we can have a bit of a chat about the issues that are raised in Georgia's book. And please use respectful and inclusive language. Abuse will not be tolerated. All right, so today we're launching Dr Georgia Munro-Cook's book, Building the WNBA from Dunking Divas to Political Actors. So Dr Munro-Cook is a Paralympian who captained the Australian Gliders wheelchair basketball team at the Tokyo 2020 Paralympics. Additionally, she is a research fellow at Griffith University. She is part of the Inclusive Futures Beacon, researching disability sport and specialising in the intersection of disability with gender. After completing her PhD in Gender Studies and History, she has written frequently about the Women's National Basketball Association and the experience of professional female basketball players. She is particularly interested in notions of embodiment, professionalisation, and the promotion and elevation of the WNBA, and how these issues interact with gender, race, class, and sexuality in broader society. So first, we're going to hear from Professor Holly Thorpe, who is one of the editors of the series. So I will hand it over to her. Just tell me to change slides, and I will.
Thanks, Adele. Kia ora koutou. Welcome, everyone. What an exciting moment to be coming together. So, yeah, thank you to Adele and Georgia for the invitation to speak briefly today. As Adele mentioned, my name's Holly Thorpe from the University of Waikato, but I'm here today as part of the editorial team behind the Palgrave Macmillan series, New Femininities in Digital, Physical and Sporting Cultures, that Georgia's book features in. And I'm co-editor with Associate Professor Kim Pavlidis from Deakin University, Associate Professor Artie Ratner from Northumbria University in the UK, and Dr Jessica Franco-Webb from the University of Bath, also in the UK. And over the past few years, since we've been running this series, we've published a number of books, and Adele's just going to kindly flick through some of those slides just so you can have a look at the different titles that have appeared in the series. You can keep going. Thanks, Adele. So these books relate to a range of topics on gender and sport, and different types of or expressions of femininity, feminist activism, and politics in an increasingly global consumer and digital world. And it was an absolute pleasure to work with Georgia, supporting her from the proposal to the final product that is being launched today. And in fact, Georgia's book is our 10th in our series, so that's very exciting for us. So we would really like to congratulate Georgia on this wonderful book, which we feel makes an important contribution to understanding the actions of players and their efforts to reform the WNBA, addressing historical, current and emerging issues to make its central arguments. And this monograph offers a wide-ranging examination of the WNBA, exploring its historical, socio-cultural and political dimensions through a range of topical issues such as the pay gap, professionalisation, athlete activism and media promotion of the league. And as editors, we found each of the chapters incredibly engaging and well written. We found ourselves completely drawn into the book, as we expect you will too. It is such a compelling and an interesting read. Georgia's also highly reflexive, and she writes herself into the text in places and clearly explains how her own positionality shaped the project. And because of this highly accessible and engaging way of writing, we're expecting this book's going to have a really wide readership well beyond academia. The interweaving of athlete interviews with media analysis and ethnographic insights is a real strength of the book, and as is the careful attention to the intersectional nature of the WNBA's promotion of the league and players' experiences of it. So this really is an incredible book, and it couldn't be more timely with the huge attention women's basketball is currently receiving in the US, and how the women's game has been attracting record-breaking crowds and television audiences. And Georgia's beautiful monograph offers a powerful historical contextualization to really help us understand what this moment means today. So from the series editors, I just want to offer Georgia our hugest congratulations. What an incredible contribution to the literature that you've made. And today we want to be able to celebrate that for you by offering from Palgrave a 20% discount on the book for those of you attending. And Adele also has the flyer of this. There's a link up the top there, a code that you can use to get that discount, and yes, highly recommended. So well done, Georgia. Huge congratulations from us. It's been an absolute pleasure working with you. And yeah, just really, really proud of you from the whole editorial team. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Holly.
Amazing words. And we will now give the floor over to Georgia, who is going to tell us, how she ended up here and a bit about the book before Simone and I start with some questions before we open the floor.
Yeah, you can go to the next slide, Adele. So when I first started researching the WNBA in around 2015 for my honours project, the WNBA was viewed as somewhat stumbling along, not about to fold, but not thriving either. NBA Commissioner Adam Silver was publicly questioning the WNBA, saying we thought that we would have broken through by now. We thought ratings and attendance would be higher. Compare this to this year, when the WNBA draft received a record 2.4 million viewers, a 307% increase up to the year before, which is part of the consistent growing rise in interest in the WNBA. A lot of this success has been attributed to #1 draft pick from this year, Caitlin Clark, whose final college game was watched by 18.9 million viewers, which was more than any other basketball game, men's or women's, since 2019. However, while Caitlin Clark is drawing more attention to women's basketball, as my book demonstrates, this growth in women's basketball did not come out of nowhere or from one person, but has been part of a long concerted effort by numerous players over many years. So I'm going to start this presentation briefly kind of discussing each chapter and finish with a more in-depth discussion of athlete activism. So the purpose of my book is to critically map the instrumental role of the players in building the WNBA, analysing how the players transformed the league from an organisation relying on femininity and heterosexuality to grow, to one that embraces alternative forms of embodiment and foregrounds the activist ideals of its players. In doing so, the book contributes to the growing literature on new femininities in sport as part of this series, highlighting the way WNBA players trouble gender norms, promote alternative femininities, and make race visible through activism. Furthermore, the book argues that visibility is not sufficient for a thriving women's sports league, emphasising the importance of safe and professional labour conditions. So Chapter 1 introduces the WNBA, as well as my methodological and conceptual approach. The writing of this book involved utilising an assortment of methods, including ethnography, where I spent some time with the WNBA team and went to the All-Star game, which you can see in some of these pictures here. I did archival research and media and autobiographical analysis, and in particular, I examined the players' own construction of their mediated self. So particularly looking at sporting autobiographies and other autobiographical texts like Player Tribune articles. So this book approaches the WNBA as an assemblage, drawing on the insights of feminist new materialism, sporting embodiment, femininity studies, and the work of Black feminist thinkers to understand the complex entanglements of gender and racialized difference. You can go to the next slide. So chapter 2 basically traces the history of women's basketball from its inception. And this was really important for me to include because one of my favourite things about history is learning about all things that we think are just obvious facts about history and about gender norms are actually way more complicated than we think. So we see the success of women's basketball now as kind of a new phenomenon. But if the history of basketball challenges that idea of linear progression. So when basketball was invented in 1891, women began playing almost immediately, albeit with the modified rules that you can see in this picture, which are pretty similar to netball. And that was a way to try and make sure that women kept their behaviour ladylike, according to the norms of the time. Not only were the women there from the beginning, but particularly on the west coast of America, basketball was viewed as a woman's sport and considered a sissy game for men. So that's kind of very different to what we view as basketball being a men's sport that women are breaking into now. Over the 20th century, the popularity of women's basketball ebbed and flowed, with competition among middle-class women constrained by female physical educators, while working-class and Black women continued to push the sport forward, particularly in states such as Iowa, where girls' basketball was more popular than boys' basketball. However, by the 1960s, basketball was firmly viewed as a men's game. This history not only sets the stage for where we are today, but the legacy of the battle to establish and control women's basketball persists and continues to influence what it means to play basketball as a woman. You can go to the next slide. When the WNBA was launched in 1997, they had to decide how to successfully market a league of Black athletic women, many of whom identify as queer, in a sport that had largely been coded as male for half a century. Chapter 3 explores how they initially decided the best way forward was to highlight its feminine, supposedly heterosexual stars, namely starting with Lisa Leslie, Cheryl Swoops, and Rebecca Lobo, as well as pushing the idea of motherhood and respectability. While the league started on a wave of optimism, attendance began to decline and 4 of the original franchises folded. Can go to the next slide, please. Instead of changing their tactics, the league decided to double down with commercials that didn't even feature basketball, but instead saw players like Tisha Panettiere driving and lounging against a yellow sports car in a gold jumpsuit, which you can see there. At the WNBA draft, players were forced to dress in a business casual style, which player Dev Peters later joked had players looking like we were going to the National Receptionists Convention. The WNBA was explicitly linking womanhood and entrepreneurship, reflecting a post-feminist neoliberal sensibility in which women were compelled to portray desirable, middle-class femininity to be successful career women in an unstable work environment where selling oneself is key. At the same time, players were both sexualized and their attractiveness and sexuality insulted. The first generation of players had to continually negotiate these shifting notions of identity and womanhood, often reinforcing, but occasionally challenging, the league's idea of what it meant to be an athletic woman. Can you go to the next slide, please? This all began to change with the 2013 draft class and the drafting of the 3 to C, who were Brittany Griner, Elena Delle Donne, and Skylar Diggins-Smith. Griner in particular forced the league to contend with how to market its most prominent college star and #1 draft pick, who did not in any way conform to the vision of femininity that the league had pushed. This is something that other players all recognise, with one player I spoke to in my ethnography telling me just her being her has allowed some change in our league, which is huge and I'm very proud of her. Chapter 4 tracks the way that Griner and others have pushed the league to embrace its queer players and fan base and allow for alternative forms of athletic femininity in its promotion, again with some fits and starts. Next slide, please. Not only are there more players that present in a masculine style or who identify as trans or non-binary like Laisha Clarendon, but there are other players that queer femininity by destabilizing the link between femininity and heterosexuality that had previously been implied. Furthermore, players stopped allowing the league to use their pregnancy as a marketing tool to bolster the idea of femininity, instead reframing it as a labour issue and demanding maternity leave and other supports. This chapter is where I push the understanding of the league forward from previous work, which largely relied on a critique of post-feminist culture. In addition to the ideas of queer femininity and female masculinity, I draw on theories of new materialism to move beyond just representation, towards understanding bodily capacity. I show how choices such as wearing a ponytail or short shorts aren't just signifiers of supposed heterosexuality, but are instead a material discursive interaction that can create a body with increased capacity to compete, a materials assemblage with an effective force rather than simply a discursive signifier. Change slides, please. So I'm going to come back to chapter 5, which is on activism at the end, to discuss in a bit more depth. But for now, I'll continue to discuss the notion of bodily capacity in chapter 6. One of the things I most wanted to explore in my book was what has been a common refrain throughout my entire playing career, which is that women play basketball differently than men. All the players I talked to and many of the biographies I read all repeated this idea, saying that women tend to play a more team-oriented game with better fundamentals and less individualistic play. However, I would argue that this is not something innate, but rather how the social constructions of gender and race work through bodies to produce a particular way of playing sport. For example, as we saw from the history of women's basketball, women were forced for many years to play team basketball due to the rule adaptations, and this legacy has persisted. Furthermore, drawing on Iris Marion Young's Throwing Like a Girl essay, I explore how even the best women athletes in the world can be constrained by fears about being too powerful, as you can see in this quote by Brittany Griner. And it's particularly true for people like Brittany Griner, whose gender presentation means that she fears the backlash that could come from using her full bodily potential. In contrast, someone like Lisa Leslie's femininity meant that she didn't face the same constraints when she was able to dunk the ball or perform other bodily feats. And I think this has tremendous implications for the future of women's basketball, because part of Caitlin Clark's appeal is her ability to dominate the ball and play a kind of more individualistic style than traditional women's basketball, which tends to involve more passing, more team-based play. However, we need to ask who has access to that style of play and what are the race and gendered implications of this? Change slides, please. So chapters 7 and 8 explore the material conditions of the league and the labour struggles that the players have fought to demand better conditions and pay. These are two of the areas that have had some of the most rapid change since I started working on this project and even since I published the book. Just yesterday, it was announced that teams would finally start playing on charter flights rather than flying commercial, something that the players have been pushing for a very long time. However, these changes in the particulars don't change the overall argument of my book, which is that the way that players have consistently viewed themselves as being professional athletes and have demanded that the league live up to this standard. Furthermore, players fought for and received higher wages in the 2020 CBA negotiations, which in many ways signalled an end of an era in which WNBA players were expected to express gratitude for the opportunity to play professional basketball at all. They instead called for the league to bet on women and make the necessary investments for the league to succeed. The success of the negotiations demonstrates the power of unions in sport and indicates that women athletes are starting to flex their power and no longer walking on eggshells to ensure the league does not collapse. Next slide, please. So I'm now going to move on to a slightly more in-depth discussion of chapter 5, which is focusing on activism and racial justice. So part of the WNBA's initial emphasis on femininity was a colourblind framing, in which race was largely ignored in favour of emphasising gender, despite the fact that the playing group is about 80% Black. This changed dramatically starting in the 2016 season, when, spurred on by the murder of Alton Sterling and Philando Castile by police, players from the Minnesota Lynx held a pre-game press conference to speak out against the murders, wearing these t-shirts that you can see on the screen. The Lynx were quickly followed by other teams who wore black t-shirts in support of Black Lives Matter instead of their team-issued warm-up tops. This first wave of protests predated NFL player Colin Kaepernick's well-documented kneeling during the national anthem, which is often viewed as the start of a new wave of athlete activism. However, like many Black women athletes in the past, the WNBA's role as leaders was minimised in favour of male athletes. Furthermore, the league struggled with how to deal with the protests, initially fining players for breaking the uniform policy. In response, the players held a media blackout, refusing to answer questions that were not about police brutality until the fines were rescinded. Next slide, please. In 2019, star player Maya Moore announced she was taking a break from the WNBA. And though initially she announced the break was to spend more time with family and religious ministry, it soon became known that she was fighting for criminal justice reform, starting the campaign Win for Justice to push for a fair trial for Jonathan Irons, a family friend who was wrongfully convicted at the age of 16. Irons was freed as a result of this, and him and Moore got married. Moore's public persona and her explicit link between social justice and religious ministry is indicative of the way sport and religion has become inextricably intertwined in American culture, and particularly the specific place of importance it holds for Black women. Black feminist thought has demonstrated how Black churches have served as the organisational base for Black civil society, providing both institutional and moral support for social justice movements. Religion is very important to WNBA players' construction of themselves and has links to the femininity and compulsory heterosexuality discourses that I discuss in Chapter 3. However, as Moore's activism shows, religion has not only been a regressive force for WNBA players, but has an important role in social justice movements. Next slide, please. So the activism of WNBA players reached a peak with the worldwide protests following the police murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, as WNBA players led protests and demanded that the WNBA respond beyond platitudes. Due to COVID-19, the 2020 WNBA season took place in a bubble-like environment that colloquially became known as the Wobble. Players demanded that the season be dedicated to Black Lives Matter, Say Her Name, and getting justice for Breonna Taylor, wearing her name on the back of their jerseys all season. The players drew particular attention to Black women who had been killed by police. They explicitly argued for an intersectional approach, recognising that police brutality against Black women is often under-publicised and that both their gender and race contribute to their oppression. Next slide, please. What caught the most attention and differed most dramatically from the activism of other leagues was WNBA players' most explicit entrance into politics. When Atlanta Dream co-owner and Republican Senator Kelly Loeffler continually denigrated the WNBA's racial justice efforts for political gain, the players decided to take a stand. Loeffler was up for re-election in 2020, so players set out to research her opponents, and after a call with Reverend Warnock, settled on him as the candidate they endorsed. Wearing Vote Warnock t-shirts to nationally televised games, players coordinated their campaign to achieve maximum publicity. In the 2 days following the initial t-shirt protests, the Warnock campaign raised $183,000 and gained 3,500 new grassroots donors, while his poll numbers steadily increased. Warnock labelled the effort a turning point for his campaign and went on to win an upset runoff election against Loeffler. Well, of course, Warnock's victory cannot be placed solely at the feet of WNBA players. What is especially noteworthy, however, is the widespread credit they were given in both sporting and non-sporting media. While this was not the first time that WNBA players had been engaged in racial justice, as we've seen, what was different about these protests was that while previous actions were largely ignored, these were not. Some of this success was due to the confined environment of the Wobble, reflecting the importance of spatial politics for feminist activism. Furthermore, it came from the collective action of the entire playing group, something very unique to sport activism, which is largely focused on individuals. WNBA players are now seen as leaders among athlete activists in a way they hadn't been before. These protests reinforce the major claim of my book, that the playing group of the WNBA have continually pushed the league to be better, and that they are the main reason that the WNBA is poised to take advantage of a phenomenon like Caitlin Clark. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. We'll stop sharing. Wonderful. Now, Simone and I are both going to just say a few words, and we have a couple of questions, and then we'll open to other questions. Shall I go first? Okay. All right. So I just wrote some words down, but it was so good to hear that overview again. And so books like this don't come along every day. Weaving historical, sociological, feminist, and even spatial analysis of the professionalization of women's basketball in the US, Dr. Munro-Cook's book is required reading for anyone working in the field of sport feminisms. The book comprehensively covers all aspects of professionalization, including issues around identity, pay and conditions, comparisons to the men's game, and activism and racial justice. Georgia presents a highly sophisticated analysis of the WNBA that needs to be the benchmark for future analysis of women's sport. If only, sport administrators would engage, and, your book is so accessible and yet so sophisticated at the same time. And I think that's a real testament to your skill as a writer and a researcher. Having read the whole book, there are so many directions to take the conversation. You really have covered so much, without it being verbose, it's all quite kind of concise as well. I think there are so many learnings for all other sports as well. So I'm just thinking a lot about the AFL work that I've been doing and the professionalization of the women's game there as I hear you talking. And I think that, I'll have to engage more as we finish our book for the series. You also take an important intersectional approach, which not that many books on the professionalization of women's sport do, accounting for the experiences of Black women in the WNBA and the activism that players have engaged in, as you've spoken about. So there are lots of questions, but I narrowed it down to two. I wanted to know more about the ethnography and the experience of spending time with the WNBA, because regardless of all the progress that we do have here in Australia, the WNBA is just so much bigger. It's just the US is so big, and there is more money in sport and things like that. So I was wondering, what was it like? Did it meet your expectations? What can you share with us about that?
Yeah, sure. I think because it was a lot bigger than maybe an Australian league, it was pretty hard to get access to a WNBA team. Luckily, one of my old coaches, because I played wheelchair basketball, and he knew some people who got me in contact with a team, and I was able to go over there. It was a bit different to some of the other ethnographies I've read in terms of a professional basketball team doesn't spend every minute of every day together, I guess. They kind of come into training, go home, and that's it. So I went to the trainings, I went to the games. They were a bit reluctant to give me access to locker rooms and things like that. So that was a bit of a limitation, I thought. Although they were very, all the women were very kind in their time in giving me interviews and things like that. In terms of the most useful thing about the ethnography, to me, it was spending time at the games and kind of understanding that effective environment of the stadium and how, you really see the physicality of women's basketball in person in a way that I don't think even women's basketball in Australia doesn't have the same level of physicality, because it's just not at that top level compared to America. So things like that were really more the most beneficial part of it.
Thank you. Yeah, it would have been an amazing atmosphere. And then my other question, so you've got a section where you discuss hair and ponytails, which I really enjoyed, because I think, to include that was important. And we do hear a lot about, blonde ponytails in Australia, but they're not always analysed as well. Could you share with us how that came to be a topic of analysis and how we might make these ideas more visible to those who haven't read your book, or, they might not engage?
I suppose the reason it came to me was when I first started watching WNBA games, I watched a lot of Sue Bird playing, and there was a lot of talk about her ponytail. And so then when I read Pat Griffin's work on, ponytails and the way it signified heterosexuality, I was like, oh, that makes sense. But then Sue Bird came out as gay, and so that kind of complicated it, and quite publicly. And then I was kind of thinking about it a bit more about my own experience. Like, I put my hair in a ponytail just because it's go time. It's time to play basketball. And then I read some more about, about this idea of like, I think it's Clark's work. I think it's part of the series actually on dancers and the way putting their hair in a bun, it means it's time to dance. So kind of thinking about it in a different way was interesting to me. And then it was complicated a bit more, I guess, by this things that have happened around Black women's hair. And I read in Lauren Jackson's autobiography and in Lisa Leslie's about it. It's in my book as well, about the time Lauren Jackson at the Olympics pulled out Lisa Leslie's hair and kind of her ponytail because it was a fake ponytail, I guess. And that kind of led me to the debates around Black women's hair and what that means in that context. So that's.
Yeah. I think that's, part of that materiality that you brought to the study that adds that sophistication. And, hair is important. So, Simone, over to you.
Thank you, Adele. And just on that note of hair, when I was growing up and engaged in equestrian sport, we had to wear hair net under our riding hats back in the day. But Georgia, look, congratulations. This is a fantastic book. I thoroughly enjoyed reading it. And there's, as Adele said, so many interesting trajectories we can explore. And I noticed we've got some comments. Jodie's already popped one in the chat. So I'm just going to ask you two questions. Adele's on that wonderful summary. I think, the intersectional focus is brilliant and really opens up different ways of thinking about how women's teams are a different force and different style of activism. And I think we're seeing that with football in Australia and in America and elsewhere. So lots of thoughts around that and in terms of where we might take that line of thinking. But I want to kind of focus in on Brittany Griner because, she just released a book about her horrendous experience in Russia. And I think she stood out as such a complex and interesting and provocative player and figure in the whole, unfolding drama of change in women's sport. So I'm interested in a little bit more about how her embodiment, the complexity of her embodiment and its incredible capacity to perform at a high level is a complicated subject position in terms of this narrative of progress about women's sport. We're going to get more equal pay, we're going to get better conditions, all those important things and material contexts for change. But she is one of these amazing players who wasn't able to express her incredible capacity. So can you speak a bit to that kind of tension, paradox that we're kind of exploring now?
Yeah, for sure. I guess I think one of the things that was very interesting to me in reading, because going into it, obviously Brittany Griner is an incredible player, and you think of her as kind of breaking these norms of embodiment in that she's the best dunker that we've ever seen in women's sport and things like that. But then reading her book, you see things like her saying that she felt worried to dunk the ball, or there were I guess other instances where she'd gotten in fights and in college and in games and had kind of received a lot of backlash for that, like people calling her a man, people calling her a bully, all these things that are very related to her gender presentation in ways that kind of the opposite has happened for other women. So again, during the comparison to Lisa Leslie, she also got in fights and similar things happened, but people were still calling her soft, as in like that she wasn't kind of that powerful person. And I think that's very much linked to the way she presents herself, and that she doesn't necessarily have these stereotypes to deal with. And Griner wasn't the only one that was saying these things as well. Like I think Sylvia Fowles said similar things about her unwillingness to dunk the ball. And again, I think that has a lot to do with the way the kind of gender and racialized dynamics work through the body. And you can But I mean, I guess the benefit is as the WNBA is getting better and these things aren't as much of a big deal, we can kind of also see the pleasures and the pleasure of dunking the ball. So kind of later, Brittany Griner talks about dunking as turning up the music on a good song and the kind of way that these things can kind of work together. So in a more supportive environment like the WNBA, she might be able to feel differently compared to her college career, because Brittany Griner went to Baylor, which is a very conservative Christian university that doesn't like gay people, pretty much. So yeah, I think to me that was the interesting way of the way these different dynamics all work through the body to produce a basketball player. And some of that does have to do with material conditions. Obviously, if WNBA players had been paid more, Brittany Griner wouldn't have been in Russia in the first place and wouldn't have had to be in that position. And there are other examples in my book of like players having to train on courts that aren't safe or don't have high enough roofs to be able to shoot threes, things like that. So I think all this stuff is interrelated, but it can't just be the material conditions. It has to be all these things working together.
Yeah, it's such a great example of how intersectionality is thought through those material and effective and discursive productions of meaning. Yeah, and how the whole league is opening a space for kind of queering gender identities. So it's a really interesting time that you've documented. So my next question is just to follow on from that. How are you thinking now in terms of your book is published, that work is done, and now we're seeing all this change, as Holly foregrounded. What are some kind of thoughts that you're having about how this work, extending your thoughts from the work to today's context?
Yeah, I think one of the things I kind of touched on a bit was about Caitlin Clark and the way her embodiment works in terms of, as I said, she gets to dominate the ball in a way that I've even seen other players be like, I wish I got to do that when I was in college. So whether that changes the WNBA, whether that changes our ideas about how women play basketball, I think I'm very interested in that. And I mean, I think all the attention on the league has led to things like the chartering of the planes. I think you can attribute that somewhat to Brittany Griner, somewhat to Caitlin Clark, very much so. Yeah, I think it'll just be interesting to see where it goes. I think it's a really exciting time to be a women's basketball fan.
It's really exciting, and I definitely think Holly's idea of a book tour in the USA or even just a conference would be a really good idea to get these ideas out there. So Jody has a question here in the chat. She wrote, some retired players, example Sue Bird, are taking their activism further, commercializing it through film, books, merchandise, and connecting with other sports like women's football. Any thoughts on how this may change power dynamics within the league?
Yeah, I think there's very much a big link between this athlete activism in general and the commercialization of the league, not just with retired players, but with players in the league, in terms of, I mean, so the 2020 season where all the athlete activism happened, WNBA ratings actually went up, whereas a lot of other sports ratings went down. Mm-hmm. So there's, for a while now, there's been kind of this idea of linking the WNBA with social justice as a marketing tool. So in the past, so in 2018, this kind of took place explicitly with the WNBA's Take a Seat, Take a Stand campaign, where they essentially said we're going to donate a portion of ticket sales to, there was a variety of organisations, including Planned Parenthood. But players were kind of annoyed about this because they weren't consulted, and none of the money went to any kind of, Black Lives Matter or any kind of racial justice organisation. Whereas I think the difference between the 2020 activism and that kind of push was it was very much player-led, and it's not solely about the commercialization. So yeah, there's always a very much big risk when you associate activism and commercialization and try and link those two things. But I think having it player-led is obviously beneficial. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure about Sue Bird's work, but yeah.
And Jody has a follow-on question. Is WNBA activism also transforming women's college basketball?
I think to an extent. I think there's been a lot more. So women's college basketball is much more conservative than the WNBA, in terms of that still has some of those people like Kim Mulkey, who's a coach, was Brittany Griner's coach at Baylor, and who basically told her not to publicly come out. So that's still a major issue in women's college sport. But there has been much more discussion around, for example, Angel Reese, who played for LSU. There was a lot of like racist backlash to her, essentially. And I think rather than kind of like covering that up, there has been much more of a recognition of that. But I do think there's still, I mean, college fans maybe are more prone to being racist or having those kind of links. There's been a lot of complaints about Iowa fans and those kind of things. So yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting, obviously. So college players have recently in the past few years been allowed to make money off their likeness, which is kind of radically transformed college basketball. So it'll be interesting, I think, going forward to see whether that leads to more or less activism. More power to the players definitely has happened, because before they were very linked to their coaching.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Sally's got a question. Did you want to speak or no?
Thanks a lot, Georgia. You're obviously a bit telepathic. I was going to say telepathetic, but you know what I mean, telepathic, because you just answered my question as I was pressing send. But yeah, it was just exactly. If you want to say anything more about the NIL changes and the athletes having a bit more autonomy, but I'm not sure how that really is going to play out, because I just feel the NCAA will still have such a firm grip on their players. But anyway, yeah. Thanks for anticipating my question.
I mean, I guess you could say that there has been more, player transfers than there has been in the past in terms of college basketball. And I think maybe having players being able to, set up their brand a bit earlier, so they're going into the WNBA with all these relationships with Nike and different brands potentially, could have an impact on the WNBA going forward.
Do we have any other questions for Georgia? I know you're now doing some work in the disability sports space. Was there anything with intersectionality and disability that came up, or is it coming up even, around neurodivergent and queer, or, in terms of WNBA, or, how do you see this fitting into your future work?
Just in terms of the actual WNBA, I think there was some in terms of Tamika Catchings, who's a ex-player. In her autobiography, she talks about being slightly deaf, and she did wear hearing aids, but basically got rid of them and stopped wearing them. But that was very much framed as in terms of that kind of more ableist overcoming disability narrative. That would probably be the only area where it explicitly came out. But in my book, I do use some of the kind of disability literature on misfitting and the idea of not fitting into certain spaces. So talking about Brittany Griner and how her, she maybe doesn't fit into certain spaces in terms of that. But I think, to me, the thing going forward in my research in disability and gender is kind of, I feel like the WNBA recently, and especially with their 2020 CBA negotiations, have really stopped aiming so low, I guess, in terms of what we want out of sports. So for me, in disability sport, I feel like we can be aiming higher in terms of, I play wheelchair basketball. I know everyone that ever comes and watches it says it's a great sport and they like watching it. So why can't we be doing more to promote it?
It will be really interesting to watch that space over the next, 5 to 10 years and see where we're headed.
Yeah, perhaps this will be one of your books in the future, Georgia. Right through the history and your experience of the women's wheelchair basketball.
Mm.
Can I ask one more question? If anyone else wants to, feel free. What, going over there and doing your ethnographic research, and really, you know, it's quite a challenging process. What do you feel was one of the most kind of effective moments in your research experience that really challenged, engaged, transformed some aspect of how you thought about the project?
Yeah, I think one of the probably for me was I went to the All-Star game, and one of the players who had been undrafted and was at the All-Star game, and she got the MVP award, and she was there and she was crying afterwards, and it was just very like emotionally affecting for me. And that kind of really made me think about the idea of reflexivity and the idea of how the researcher's own emotions are kind of caught up in the whole thing. Yeah, because obviously going into this project, I'm a fan of the WNBA, so you don't want that to colour your thinking. So that was just a really interesting way of, yeah, being able to think through how my own emotions kind of can affect the whole process.
Thank you. Holly.
Thank you. Georgia, I have you know, we see a lot of proposals that come through the series, people proposing to turn a PhD into a book, and it's quite hard, as you know, right, to do a good job of that. I think you've done an excellent job of that, extending things that, you know, to keep it contemporary and relevant. I wonder if you could speak a little bit to that process, and perhaps, you know, to others, if you had some advice for others who have recently finished a PhD, thinking about turning it into a book. What advice would you give them?
Oh, that's a good question. I think I was really lucky in my whole process in that my supervisor was very much like, you want to turn this into a book afterwards. You know, frame your chapters around kind of writing it as a book. And I was also quite lucky in that lots of things change very quickly in the WNBA, so you can extend it. And as I thought through more things, got wonderful feedback from my examiners. Yeah, I was able to kind of adapt those things, take out, maybe kind of like refine some of the theoretical work as I learnt more throughout working and reading other books. Yeah, I think honestly, to me, it was just kind of the confidence of actually being like, oh no, this is something that's worth saying, and I'm going to try and put it out there. Yeah.
Well, I'm very, very glad you did. Thanks, Georgia.
Thank you.
Sally.
Just one quick more question. From a sort of sport management-y perspective, is there any like athlete representation on the board or whatever kind of organization the WNBA is? Do they have a meaningful relationship with the big organization?
So they have a players association, like a union that negotiates with the league. Yeah, so any kind of changes that have happened, so the negotiations to have the 2020 season in the one location, they all happen through negotiation with the players association.
And does that also cover does that also include sort of more kind of socially orientated questions as well, or is it very much the operational business?
No, I think socially oriented questions as well. Like I think they managed a lot of these protests and things that happened.
Right. Yeah. I was just thinking of that, you know, your comments about the future of the WNBA and how it's, you know, tied up with social commentary and social protest and what that relationship is like with WNBA, with the Uber body. Be just kind of interesting. Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Do we have any more questions? We've got a few more minutes. Otherwise, we can, I suppose, wrap up a few minutes early.
I just wanted to pick up on that really important point, and I'm still thinking about the implications of it, but how women's teams and leagues are positioned as activists in that collective sense. And, you know, I think if we're thinking like we're beyond post-feminist arguments as you're making, and this is an interesting turn and kind of pushback against individualism as well. So it's fascinating to see how it's playing out in different commercial contexts and labour rights contexts. So I think it's fascinating. I think this is another area of study for someone to do some more work in.
Like the women's soccer in America as well, like such an activist team, and everyone deciding together that that was the stance they're going to make, and it being a strong part of their identity. Yeah. Jodie's got another question. What about lessons for the WNBL? I think that's a good question.
Yeah, that is a good question. I mean, I think the Australian context of the WNBL, does obviously change some things. I mean, my number one thing that I'm sure everyone who studies women's sport would say is it needs more investment. It needs people that can train full time. So like some of the players I spoke to when I was in America play in both the WNBL and the WNBA. And essentially they were saying the like level of professionalism is night and day, because I mean, this was 5 years ago. I think they've had a pay rise since then, but like some of the players in the WNBL were having to work other jobs as well. So they can't necessarily play to that high level of quality. So yeah, that would be the number one thing. It is interesting, like a lot of WNBA players do come and play in the WNBL during the off season. So, I mean, it is a good league, and I think could definitely, with more investment and more advertising. And I know personally for me, the Sydney team kind of moved, was doing some like double headers with the men, and it actually just made it like a lot harder to attend games. So I wonder if kind of advertising it more as a individual league would be a better option.
Yeah, there is that tendency in Australia to kind of have it connected to the men's game. Also, I don't think we see as many. We see a little bit of like player activism here, but not that much. Yeah. Do you have any sense of perhaps, you know, what you think is, you know, the barrier, I guess, for Australian players in all sports, you know, too?
I do wonder if the WNBA being a more established league and the Players Association having been around for 20 years, obviously makes it easier to be activist. I think you have a lot more power in that case when you have a strong union. Obviously, just the different demographics of the league, I think, would change the kinds of things that players would be more interested in being activist about. Yeah, that'd probably be the two main things, I think.
Yeah. All right. Well, congratulations. You are launched officially out in the world. Yeah, I think, yeah, hopefully I recommend everybody get a copy of the book and, yeah, read it and learn, and we can continue to build on your work and what's come before that to, to continue to do what we do. We're always happy to hear from people who would like to be part of our SAGE seminar series too. So please do get in touch. And yeah, thank you everyone for coming along, and thanks to Holly for coming and representing the editors of the series, which is a wonderful series, and to Georgia for coming along and sharing about your process and the book with us. All right. Thanks everybody.
Everyone. Great to see you all.
Yes.
Book proposals into Holly.